Rajesh Merchandani, Senior Advisor to the UN Foundation, and welcome to the launch of the UN Development Programme's Human Development Report. The report tracks humanity's progress using indicators beyond only GDP, and ever since the first report in 1990, we've seen steady upward progress for most of the world. But that's changed. One of the starkest findings of the report is that human development has fallen in 90% of countries. Today, we're going to learn more about the report. We'll hear about overlapping crises facing the world and the insecurity they're generating. But we'll also think about how to create policies that actually deliver for people in such unsettled times. We'll be hearing from world leaders, prominent advocates like Mary Robinson and the actor Michelle Yeoh, young activists, brilliant social scientists and civil society leaders. And you'll get a chance to ask your questions to our speakers and to the team behind the report using the Q&A function. There's a link to the report and all the underlying data in the chat. This event has simultaneous translation into Spanish and French. Just click on the interpretation tab on the bottom of your Zoom interface. And finally, we need your help to make this a loud conversation. So please post on social using the hashtag HDR2022 and follow all the HDR related news on Twitter at HDRUNDP. It's already kicking up a storm on the world's media today, so we want you to join that conversation. Okay. To set the stage for our conversation today, let's hear first of all from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
Our world faces widespread and interlinked challenges that are unsettling lives and disrupting the global economy. They are triggering spikes in food and energy prices, driving up inflation and drowning vulnerable countries in debt. An uneven economic recovery from the pandemic is further exacerbating inequalities and leaving entire regions behind. This comes at a time when developing countries are already struggling with a slate of challenges not of their making, from the pandemic to the impact of the climate crisis, to debt distress and the lack of access to adequate resources to finance the recovery in the context of persistent and growing inequalities. We are now facing a perfect storm that threatens to devastate the economies of many developing countries. Meanwhile, a growing mental health epidemic is affecting millions of people around the world. This year's Human Development Report shows how these widespread challenges are causing immense uncertainty, and uncertainty is costly. For the first time ever, the world's total human development has declined for 2 years in a row. The report puts forward a clear solution. We must double down on human development and advance policies around the so-called 3 I's: investments, insurance, and innovation. We must invest in global public goods, expand insurance through social safety nets, and innovate, fostering new pathways and technologies. This is vital to empowering people, rescuing the Sustainable Development Goals, and truly shaping a better future in a world of transformation. Thank you.
4, 3.
That's the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres there. In a moment, we are going to do a deep dive into the report and learn much more about its details. But I quickly want to say hello to my brilliant guests who are going to help make sense of its findings and implications. With me in the studio are UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner and UN Youth Envoy Jayathma Wickramanayake. And then also joining us live from Dublin is Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, now Chair of the Elders, and also the 2019 recipient of the UN Foundation's highest award, Global Champion for Change. Panel, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to dive right in with picking up on a couple of things that the Secretary General just talked about. He talked about saving the SDGs, which is darker language than I've ever heard from him before. And he described these overlapping crises that lead to a complex of uncertainty for people all over the world. And that's one of the key themes of the report. So Achim Steiner, head of the agency that produced the report, set the stage for what we're about to learn more of when we do a deeper dive into the report. These overlapping crises, what are they and how are they affecting people around the world?
Well, first of all, the Human Development Report has for over 30 years now provided these snapshots in terms of human development. So as you also alluded to in the Secretary General, what we are documenting this year is an unprecedented reversal in human development. We have lost 5 to 6 years in terms of progress. So I think that in itself is evidence enough to start asking the question, what is happening to us and why is it happening? Why are we not acting on this? And the crises are obviously manifold. We have the shock of COVID-19, but we already had the inequality tensions in our societies before. COVID-19 reminded us of what inequality means in a pandemic. We have since then seen conflict and the impact also of the war in Ukraine on global grain markets, on fuel markets, on our global economy. Price explosion, cost of living is escalating. In many countries, the means to actually respond to this crisis is constrained. And that, all of that, on top of what last year's report focused on, living in the age of the Anthropocene, the challenge of climate change, undermining everything that we have built over hundreds of years, if not millennia, and therefore a moment of paralysis also that we are facing in our world, in our international community. And what the report really is saying is we need to focus back on people and the choices that they are able to make. And the report in many ways is about the thousands of choices we can make every day and differently.
Okay. I'm going to come back for much more on that. Mary Robinson, Achim Steiner mentioned a few of the crises the world is facing, but, we've also got the challenges of technological innovation and increasing polarization as well. And, as someone who in her work focuses a lot on intersectional inequality and justice, to what extent do you think that this report underlines that the crises we are facing are adding up to more than the sum of their individual parts?
I'm afraid I share deeply the concern about the fact that this report shows backward movement on the Human Development Report. I remember the report from the beginning, and every year we expected progress, not necessarily on all sectors, but more overall progress. Now, this is really shocking that we're going back at a time when we've must make progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is true that for me, the greatest threat is the climate crisis. It's looming together with COVID, together with the inequality that was mentioned, together with conflict, Ukraine, etc. But actually, the climate crisis is the existential threat, and unfortunately, it appears to be accelerating from all the impacts we're seeing and all the advice of the scientists. And somehow, it's great to be on this panel with Achim and Jaya. I know both very well. I know their commitment. I know we will get deeper into the report. But actually, I'm worried about the mental health problem of people. I think we're going to have a more positive narrative. And I want to suggest that that narrative could be and should be, what if our best world is still ahead of us? That was something I learned from an Indigenous woman who's part of a Connected Women Leaders network that I belong to. It is. The best world is still ahead of us if we make that choice. And that's an important thing to say. Climate is human-induced. It's, as you particularly brought out in last year's report. And therefore, we can change. We can accelerate into the clean energy and caring about biodiversity, etc. That's our choice. Do we want to choose our future actively and in a way that affirms empowerment for people all over the world? I believe we do.
I love that. What if our best world was ahead of us? I love that. Thank you. Jayathma, young people are going to inherit this mess. And the truth is that despite the brilliant reframe that Mary just gave us, the report says that half the world feels worse off than a generation ago. Half the world doesn't think that the best world is ahead of us. How are you seeing this kind of insecurity play out amongst global young people?
Rajesh, the topic of the report that we're talking today is uncertain times, unsettled lives, and shaping the future in a transforming world. I think there can be no better tagline to define the young people of today, the young generation of today, what they're going through in their day-to-day lives, in their physical realities, in their mental health. This is an issue that young people, whether they are in a developed country or developing country, are deeply concerned and deeply worried about. If we look at main indicators in human development, education, employment, health, the numbers have been really bad, at least in the past 2 years. 224 million children are still out of school, not able to recover from the pandemic. As Mary said, 1 in 5 young people says that at some point in their day, they feel depressed. And these are not good indicators when we think about the generation that is going to take over the baton from the current leaders and really develop and drive our world into a more just, fair, sustainable world. But what is also positive is that they're optimistic. While they're struggling with all of these challenges, young people are still telling us that they have hope about the future, that they have optimism towards the future, but only in certain conditions where we work together, where we collaborate across borders, across countries, across regions, and where we are truly inclusive in the way we make decisions about our future.
Wow, what is it Kofi Annan said, you're never too young to lead. I mean, that's a great example right there. Okay, I think we want to learn a little bit more about what's in the latest Human Development Report. So for that, let's turn to the team that compiled it. The director and lead author is Pedro Conceição, and earlier he and some of his team put together this deeper dive.
Climate change, hunger, inequality. We know the challenges. We understand how we must respond. So what is standing in our way? Our Human Development Report says that it is because lives are being unsettled and times are uncertain in ways that have no precedent.
Lives are unsettled in many ways. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 6 in 7 people worldwide felt insecure. And stress is rising too, as you can see. Before 2020, reversals in the Human Development Index were rather uncommon. About 1 out of 10 countries, including during the period of global financial crisis. But in 2020 and 2021, it rose to 9 out of 10 countries. Global development has been turned on its head. And that is why the Global Human Development Index has declined for the first time and 2 years in a row. It is back to its 2016 level. Unsettled lives, unsettled minds. As shown in this graph, we are facing a crisis in mental health. In total, 1 in 8 now suffer from mental health disorders, 10 percentage points higher than a decade ago. This is a challenge for those affected and is a major roadblock to advancing human development. Why are lives being unsettled?
The reason, we believe, is that uncertainty is changing. Yes, we've always lived with uncertainty. There's nothing new about disease, war, or poverty. But today, there are 3 new and interacting layers of uncertainty. First, we confront a new planetary reality with climate change, biodiversity loss, and new diseases like COVID-19. They are all driven and amplified by inequalities. Second, we are pursuing a massive transformation towards a low-carbon future, all while technological innovation is also racing ahead. And third, there is widespread and intensifying polarization across and within countries. Together, they form what we call a new uncertainty complex, and it is unsettling lives everywhere.
As a result, people feel more insecure. More insecure people tend to trust others less. And as the slide shows, they are more likely to hold extreme political views. With insecurity increasing, fewer than 30% trust others, its lowest recorded value. And we see rising political polarization. At the limit, this can turn into violent conflict, which is already affecting more than 1.2 billion people. Democratic practices like freedom of expression are under stress. And this is making it harder to come together to tackle shared problems at a time when we need to most.
So what to do? Uncertainty can also broaden our horizons about what we can achieve. It can make what was once unfeasible now possible. The response to COVID-19, despite the many challenges and glaring inequalities, has provided some examples. There were new vaccines, bold policies for social protection, and we all adopted new social norms and behaviors. To harness these new possibilities, we must embrace uncertainty. But to do this, people need to feel safe and in control of their own lives. How do we achieve this?
Both policies and social norms need to change. We can start in two ways. On the one hand, policies to ramp up investment in people, insurance to protect from the ups and downs, and innovation to respond to whatever challenges humanity might face. On the other, by shifting social norms through education to strengthen agency, through social recognition and representation to acknowledge everyone's right to be heard. Social movements can help lead the way.
Ultimately, to navigate uncertainty, we need to double down on human development. Doubling down on human development means improving health and education, but also giving people a greater sense of control over their lives. By addressing inequality and enhancing people's freedoms and opportunities, we can unlock human potential, enabling choices so people can thrive today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks to Pedro Conceição and the Human Development Report Office team for the report and also that video summary for us. Panel, there's a lot to process in there, most of it pretty depressing, I have to say, but I'm glad that they kind of turned the corner at the end by telling us that uncertainty broadens horizons about what we can achieve. Audience, don't forget you can download the report on the website, hdr.undp.org. Achim Steiner. The report and the Secretary General earlier talked about the 3 I's: innovation, investment, insurance. These are ways, as Mary says, to think about the future being, our best future being ahead of us. But why these things? How are they going to help make people's lives less uncertain and less insecure?
Well, Rajesh, let me wholeheartedly agree that the best times lie ahead of us if we make smart, intelligent, wise choices. And I think here I want to pick up on something the Secretary General said. We need to save the SDGs, not because they're an adopted resolution in the General Assembly from 2015, but because that was the moment when the world agreed on the greatest risks to our common future. This is a rare gift we have. We have actually something that gives us a template on how to deal, for example, with investments in the future, on how to deal with risks and therefore use the notion of insurance and also how to use innovation. But for that, we have to change the metrics with which we actually invest and think about the future. Just to go back to GDP growth, gross domestic product, per capita incomes, is not enough. In fact, it's distorting our reality. We have to expand our view. The metrics of the future are going to deal with inequality, with sustainability, with decarbonization, with technology being introduced in our societies, not only in one part of the world, but across the globe. And that's where investment refers to a different way of coming out of this crisis. We have to manage this crisis. This is for every country, every community right now, a nightmare to manage. Many developing countries are facing bankruptcy at the moment in terms of their debt load, while they're supposed to actually deal with another set of crises right now. Insurance is about resilience also and being able to either look at social protection. In COVID-19, we learned a lot about what it means to be able to help people at a moment where they cannot help themselves and then come out of crisis. And innovation is another good example. The technologies that are out there right now, whether it is digital, whether it's AI, but also renewable energy technologies. Development through decarbonization is a good example. It's about investment. It's also about dealing with the risks of simply sticking to our current energy system. It's about innovation. The report is full of these examples. And what we're trying to convey to people is that, our problems are very serious right now. We understand what the solutions are. Why on earth are we not acting? And this brings us all back to where Jayatma took us just now. It's about people, it's about choices. And one of the things the report really delves into much deeper is why have we lost so much trust in our institutions, in our neighbors, in the international community? And to some extent, how do we rebuild that trust and also the confidence that actually the future that could lie ahead of us could still be the best one? We often forget that at this moment in time, we are the wealthiest, most educated, most capable and technologically empowered generation in human history. And what a mess we're making of it.
Wow, okay. Mary Robinson, Jayatma Wikramanayake, just I want you to hold for 1 second. I want to get some reaction now to the report, some responses from some world leaders. First, let's go to a country with a large youth population and one at the forefront of several of the crises that we've heard about. I want to hear from Tanzania and President Samia Suluhu Hassan. Let's take a listen now.
Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellency Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister of New Zealand, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I feel greatly honored and privileged to speak on this auspicious occasion of the launch of the Human Development Report for the year 2021-22, which is entitled Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives, Shaping Future in a Transforming World. I commend you, Mr. Secretary General, the Human Development Report Advisory Board for the year 21-22, and indeed the entire UN Secretariat for putting together this comprehensive report. I particularly commend the United Nations for the sterling job it continues to do in coordinating global efforts towards addressing challenges and tapping into opportunities. Excellencies, the authors of this report that we are launching today could not have chosen a better title. We are indeed living through uncertain times, and it is safe to say that the world is at an inflection point. A multitude of devastating global events, ranging from the COVID-19 pandemic through climate change and the ongoing war in Ukraine, causing uncertainties all across the globe, not least in Africa. We often see the growing evidences of climate change from persistent droughts, floods, fires, and severe storms. In my own country and further to the eastern and northern African regions, we're experiencing consecutive seasons of poor rains and droughts, putting millions of people at risk of starvation and economic catastrophe. All this happens on the heels of COVID-19 pandemic that has claimed many lives and damaged livelihoods. As it has been said by many, the pandemic has compounded the inequalities both within and between our countries, with women bearing the brunt of it all. I know I'm not alone in worrying about what might happen next, but I take comfort from a saying in my local language, Swahili, which says kujikwaa sio kuanguka, ila ni kwenda mbele, which means to stumble is not to fall, but to move forward. This is the fundamental message of hope I take from this report, which you are launching here today. Global humanity development indeed stumbled, and it stumbled badly in the face of COVID-19. But humanity did not fall. People did not give up, and that's why we are seeing societies recovering almost everywhere. Let us take this opportunity to uplift humanity in its wider sense, so as to move forward to transform our world basing on the principles of inclusion and global solidarity. The pandemic is a wake-up call. It has reminded us that every country must change the way in which we are thinking about development to ensure our children and the future generation will not pay the price for our mistakes. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I applaud the calls in this report for the world to work together to tackle our shared challenges today and tomorrow. It has become increasingly clear over the last years, neither viruses nor climate change respect national borders. They can hurt anyone, anywhere, and at any time. We all have a part to play to build a better future and to invest in human development is the way forward. I thank you for your kind attention. Asanteni sana.
President Hassan of Tanzania there, you would have heard her thank, amongst other people, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand. She was hinting that we're actually going to be hearing from Prime Minister Ardern shortly. But panel, I want to just reflect a little bit with you on some of the things that President Hassan raised. She highlighted there the impacts of COVID and climate and the need to do development differently. Mary Robinson, Jayathma Wickramanayake, at the heart of all these crises is the issue of justice, intergenerational, but also between countries. We see this on climate, Mary, and on the initial response, global response at least, to COVID. Yet at the same time, leaders know that we can't tackle global challenges unilaterally or in isolation. President Hassan called COVID a wake-up call. We seem to be having lots of wake-up calls, and I just wonder, what are your thoughts on this? If we know what we need to do, why aren't we doing it? Mary Robinson, let's start with you.
But I think it might help to just look at what happened during COVID and learn some lessons. First of all, we got vaccines in moonshot time.
Yeah.
Nobody expected they would come so quickly, and we got delivery of them, though there was not equitable access to vaccines. We didn't manage that. Secondly, we had huge behavior change. People were doing things they weren't doing before. Social distancing, washing their hands. All of this was, new, and it was all over the world. And we did it because it was important. We were guided by the health scientists. We need to be guided by the climate scientists now in order to know what we have to do. We have to reduce carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 in order to be on track for a net zero world by 2050. 2030 is going to be 7 years away in January. It's just around the corner. So we need that moonshot mentality. And we need to take advantage and not waste another crisis, the Ukraine war, which has been devastating, both in European terms, an aggressive war of aggression by the Russian Federation on Ukraine, causing huge devastation in Ukraine itself, huge refugees, especially throughout Europe. But it has caused devastation also, as I know, in African countries and other developing countries, in food, fuel and fertilizer costs. And to an already population that had suffered COVID and continued to suffer the climate crisis. So when I say let's not waste, I think Ukraine is another kind of helpful in that sense, call to get away from dependence on gas from Russia, but also coal, oil and gas. We need to move much more rapidly into clean energy. Again, moonshot mentality. And the last thing, and it's been mentioned a few times, the need for the sort of, and first of all, and also we need to get energy to developing countries as a priority. I like the South African example out of Glasgow, and I've been in South Africa looking at what they're doing, the 8.5 billion to help South Africa come out of coal. We need far more packages like that, packages put together by countries and the private sector to help countries to move much more rapidly to clean energy. But just the final point I wanted to make was about trust. The report does bring out a breakdown in trust, but there is great trust. There's great trust, as Jaya would know, in the youth movement. Incredible trust. There's great trust in the women leaders networks. I see that all the time. So I think we're going to build with moonshot mentality out of those movements, that broader, with a positive narrative, determined civil society, climate justice, movement that will shift and push the leaders of the world, the investors, and in particular the fossil fuel companies that seem so stuck in their ways that are profitable to so many of them.
Okay, Jathma?
I think, Rajesh, to answer your question, we know we have the answers, but why aren't we acting on it? I think two things. First, for the past few years, we've embraced this leadership model of lack of accountability. I think we've let leaders, let governments make commitments, but not follow up, but not hold them accountable. And there's this huge gap and mistrust, as Mary said, between the leaders and the people that they govern. So if I could propose another I to the 3 I's that was mentioned in the report, I would say inclusivity. I think a part of the reason why we are in this mess right now, it is because our decision making, our policy making, our parliaments, our municipal councils have not been inclusive of the populations that we are trying to serve. Partly because it's mostly men, and it's mostly older men still making decisions for entire populations that they do not even represent. So we need to get more women into politics, women into decision-making processes. We need to get more younger people elected into parliament, elected into decision-making positions, and make sure that our society is reflected where decisions are being made. I think that's the only way that we can make sure that same people don't benefit from new programs and new approaches, that we build greater trust, because trust builds on greater equality. And that's the only way that we can achieve this transformational world, even in uncertain times.
Okay, I mean, that's actually a really good point for us to head to New Zealand now, because we got some more reaction from Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, and I think she's going to pick up on some of the points that you just talked about there. So if we can get that video ready, let's play that now for our audience.
Ina mana, ina reo, in iwi e rau rangatira. I'm honoured to speak at the launch of the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Report 2021-22. Uncertain times, unsettled lives, shaping our future in a world in transformation. Aotearoa New Zealand warmly acknowledges UNDP's valuable work in helping the global community to understand the impact of recent events, COVID-19, the effects of climate change, the war in Ukraine, and the food security crisis. Since 2019, progress towards many of the Sustainable Development Goals has been delayed or even reversed. Uncertainty and polarisation have increased, as have poverty, inequality, vulnerability, and humanitarian need. But we must not let ourselves be disheartened or deterred. Instead, we must recommit to reducing inequality. Aotearoa New Zealand wholeheartedly agrees with the premise underpinning the Human Development Report. Economic growth cannot be the sole measure of progress. In fact, it is one of the reasons we introduced a wellbeing framework for our national budget process. Sustainable development depends on equitable, inclusive opportunities to thrive and upholding the well-being of our people and our planet. New Zealand, for instance, aspires to be the best place in the world to be a child. We want our young people to reach their full potential so they have the confidence and skills to shape our society for good. We strongly support efforts to ensure that women and girls in all their diversity, persons with disabilities, youth and the elderly, Indigenous peoples, and citizens from least developed countries, landlocked developed countries, and small island developing states are able to benefit equally from social, economic, and political progress. Fully unlocking the world's human potential will enable our communities to face the future and actively shape it for the better, with confidence and unity.
Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand there, talking about the importance of diversity and ensuring that everyone benefits from progress. And Jayathma, you before the video mentioned adding a fourth I, inclusivity, to the three I's that the report highlights: innovation, investment and insurance. Achim Steiner, let's just pick up on a couple of these points. No one's going to disagree that decision-making, global policy-making needs to be more diverse and more inclusive. We also, the report highlights that there's growing polarization where we don't even agree on basic facts. So how do you tackle that in order to reach the kind of wonderful decision-making processes that we all want to see happen and that we've described here?
Well, I think what makes this Human Development Report so important is that it delves deeper into, if you want, the human psyche in the midst of crisis. I think we have heard from everyone this morning this acknowledgement that, you know, uncertain times, unsettled lives is not just a slogan. I mean, it actually goes to the core of a condition in which we find ourselves. People are under stress, they're distressed. Our world is on fire, it's underwater, it's falling apart in many of the fundamentals that we have built over decades, including our international institutions. So I think part of where we are trying to come or head to is to first of all recognize that the current rhetoric that divides us, that allows the lack of trust in institutions, in our neighbors, to increasingly drive a narrative of conflict and competition, and returning to a period where the greatest thing we supposedly can do in the 21st century to deal with the great challenges is to rearm. I mean, clearly this is a moment where people, young people, women, civil society movements need to step up. They need to step into the center of the arena, because the politics of the day around the world right now is one of polarization, growing extremism, disengagement. And when our institutions fail in our governance systems, then people go onto the street. And that is not the greatest way in which to drive change, but it often becomes inevitable. Much of the report, therefore, is trying to draw attention to the fact that we need to listen to people, empower them to also make choices. And the choices that they are making when they are given the opportunity. Take New Zealand, take Tanzania, take a country like Kenya. 90% of its electricity today is renewable. Take a country like Uruguay. It made a deliberate choice to invest in renewable energy systems. Over 90% of its electricity is being generated. Take Denmark, approximating 70% of its electricity being generated by renewables. This argument that we are forced by crisis and short-term responses to do the wrong thing in terms of the long term is the greatest lie of our century. And that is why I think this report matters, because it puts really the power to decide and the power to choose back to where it belongs, namely people, but not agitated, distressed people alone. It's our institutions, civil society, private sector leaders, government leaders, we need to step up and we need to understand that it's not my problem or your problem, it's our problem. And this is where also the idea of multilateralism is not some, recourse to a long gone dream. We established the United Nations, for example, the Bretton Woods institutions, in the midst of the darkest moments of the Second World War. They weren't established after, they were ratified after the Second World War. They were designed in the midst of the Second World War. We are in an equivalent moment in history. We need to rethink about how we come together despite our differences and invest together in the kinds of choices that are here. Metrics of the future need to become the unifying element.
Okay, briefly, Mary and Jayathma, because I want to go to another quick video and then get some wrap-up thoughts. I would just, 30 seconds each, would love to get you to pick up on what Achim Steiner talked about there. How do we start creating this kind of more inclusive system that young people can trust, that people see themselves in more? Jayathma?
I think there's two things. One, we need to start addressing issues that young people care about. When I speak to young people, I look for the reasons of apathy that we see among some of them. And the main reason is they don't feel that the current political system and current leadership actually addresses issues that they care about, like climate action, like human rights, like peace and security. So they feel trapped in a system that they have no say in creating or running. Therefore, I think making sure that leaders are sensitive to the needs and aspiration and hopes of future generations, because at the end of the day, it's not only for young people and future generations, it is also for those who are alive today that we are making these decisions. So as Achim said, very much moving forward from short-termism to long-termism, making sure that we take into consideration the aspect of future generations and impact of our decisions on their lives is extremely important if we are to rebuild that trust with children and young people.
And actually, there is supposed to be a Summit of the Future next year, I think. Mary Robinson, briefly, 1 quick minute from you on designing more inclusive policy-making systems.
Well, just building on what Jaya has been saying, I also think, and the elders will be pressing for an upgrade in our global financial system so that it's fit for the 21st century challenges. And we need institutions that will fund our future and not leave us kind of lurching from one crisis to another. And we need, visionary leaders. And I'm thinking, yes, Jacinda Ardern, of course, and the president of Tanzania that we've heard, but also Maya Motley and the US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. They seem to be really thinking about, re-looking at how we improve our financial institutions. That's very necessary. And then the inclusive movement. I saw the difference it makes when you can get grassroots and indigenous and young climate activists at the table in COPs. I literally saw it shook up the delegates. They focus too much on the small print of line by line, and they fight bureaucratic wars with each other instead of taking a holistic approach to the fact that we have an existential threat of both climate and the loss of biodiversity, and we have to come together and collaborate to address them.
Okay, panelists, I just want to keep you for a few more minutes, if I may. Before we wrap up with our first panel, I want you to stay because I want to get your thoughts on one more video that is responding to the report. And this one comes from the UN Goodwill Ambassador, Michelle Yeoh.
It is my honor to be speaking to you as a UNDP Goodwill Ambassador. This new Human Development Report tells a powerful story of life in 2022. As an actor, I rely on having a script to follow, but there is no script for life. We do not know what will happen in the next scene, nor are we able to rehearse how we should react. The best we can do is develop the skills to navigate a future where the only certainty is the uncertainty of tomorrow. With dramatic global setbacks in human development and with stress, sadness, and anger on the rise worldwide, we really cannot afford to wait to take action. 1 in 6 children are living in conflict zones. The most vulnerable in society have been hardest hit by the pandemic, climate change, and the greatest cost of living crisis in a generation. The good news is that we have more tools than ever to help us navigate these uncertain times. First, we need to set a new course by diffusing polarization, rebuilding trust, and allowing everyone to be part of decision making. But we need to start now. By unlocking our human potential, by tapping into our creativity and diversity, this year's Human Development Report challenges us to imagine and create a future in which we can all thrive, even in the face of great uncertainty. Where we go from here is up to us.
UNDP Goodwill Ambassador Michelle Yeoh there. You know, the line that really stood out to me from what she said was this one: the only certainty is the uncertainty of tomorrow. Wow. Panel, with that in mind, and I just want 30 seconds from you each, like quick fire round. What is the one thing you are urging policymakers to start doing differently now? And Mary Robinson, why don't we start with you?
I'd like to see more of a moonshot mentality because we are in existential crises. We've talked about the ones that are covered by the Human Development Report, but there's also the nuclear crisis. So if we could get leaders to be in crisis mode now about our world, that means they will have to cooperate because no country, as has been said, can deal with this on their own. I think we can get back to more cooperation if we see the way in which we're in crisis and that we have to choose this best world. And therefore, we have to collaborate together to get to this best world.
Okay, Mary, thank you so much. Jayathma.
Rajesh, if the only certainty is going to be uncertainty for the future, then we need resilient societies. Then we need adaptable societies who can adapt to those uncertainties, those shocks, and still thrive within uncertainties. So making investments is the best way to make sure that we build resilient societies. Let's invest in education. Let's invest in health. Let's invest in creating decent job opportunities for young people. So we create a society that is equal. We create a society that is resilient, that is able to thrive.
Just a small tribute to Michelle Yeoh also. She, in a sense, beat us to the post with her latest movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Could have been the title of this year's UNDP Human Development Report. Michelle, thank you for all the brilliant work that you do. And a brief remark on how to get out, if I could choose one priority. Let's invest in one another. It helps us with the short-term crisis. Let's see the Paris Agreement supported, the long-standing commitments. Let's see the international financial community stepping up with the debt crisis. Let's help countries invest in transitions. Let's invest in one another. Money isn't everything, but in the midst of a crisis, to not have any funds left actually paralyzes us, and it turns us against each other. Because there's extraordinary wealth in the world. We have all the money we need that we ever would need to deal with these crises. We are just not deploying it in a way that gives people confidence and hope. And I think in that sense, let's in the short term perhaps try and address this issue. What we're seeing is the opposite. The wealthiest countries are cutting humanitarian aid, they're cutting ODA in many parts of the world. We are defunding the very system on which we depend in order to come out of this crisis together.
Okay, panel, thank you so much for your thoughts and your expertise. Audience, don't forget to keep the conversation going on social using the hashtag HDR and HDR 2022. We're going to release these experts now. Thank you so much, Joachim Steiner, Jayathma Wickramanayake and Mary Robinson. In a moment, please stay with us because we're going to be hearing from more global experts, social scientists and civil society leaders about how to shape our future in an uncertain world. But first, let's just remind ourselves of some of the key points in the Human Development Report.
The last 2 years have had a devastating impact for billions of people around the world. And for the first time, human development has declined for 9 out of 10 countries around the world. These challenges are hitting us at the same time and interacting to create new threats and make us feel insecure, unsafe, and untrusting of each other. This is the world today, in which we know what obstacles we face, but seem paralyzed from taking sufficient action. To break this impasse, we must double down on human development to tackle disadvantages and support people's empowerment. We must also recognize and treat the global mental health crisis that undermines human development. and recognize the polarization that is more deeply dividing us, making collective responses harder. Uncertainty has unsettled our lives, but it can also broaden our horizons. It can challenge us to rethink what was once thought impossible, to chart a new course for humanity. Policies that focus on the 3 I's can be powerful tools. We need to invest in the capabilities people need to thrive. Ensure so that everyone is protected in an uncertain world. And innovate technologically, economically, and socially to respond to whatever challenges come next. We must re-examine assumptions to develop a wider set of policy options needed to navigate uncertainty, to unlock human potential, and to protect the planet, and provide people with the tools they need to feel more secure and have hope for the future. This is human development. There is promise and peril in uncertainty. Tipping the scales towards hope is up to us.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Rajesh Merchandani, reporting live from the SDG studio at UN headquarters in New York. And we're talking about the latest Human Development Report from the United Nations Development Programme. The report's full title is Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives, Shaping Our Future in a Transforming World. Here it is. I feel like we've talked a lot about the uncertain times and the unsettled lives. So let's shift a little bit to thinking about shaping the future. We have an amazing panel of social scientists and civil society activists and leaders. Let me introduce them to you. Sitting next to me, Michelle Lamont is Professor of Sociology at Harvard University, one of the world's leading sociologists. Joining us on the screen is Ilona Sabo de Carvalho, founder and president of the Igarape Institute in Brazil, and another global activist and civil society leader. And then also here in the studio with me, Victor Galas, Deputy Director of the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which is part of Stockholm University. And the Resilience Centre is also the organisation that really got the world to think in terms of planetary boundaries and humans' impact on the planet. Audience, there will be time for questions from you via the Q&A function, and UNDP experts are on hand to respond to some of your questions in the chat. So, panellists, what I want to do, first of all, is a really quick fire round, just to kind of set the scene, get you all kind of like fired up and talking. And I just want a 1-minute response from each of you to this question. It's going to be the same question, and then we'll go deeper. So the question is this. The report highlights uncertainty due to humans' impact on the planet, due to sweeping societal transformations, due to polarization. And all these crises are overlapping and amplifying each other to create insecurity in unprecedented ways. We've heard some of the stark statistics. So I want to know from each of you, what is your key takeaway from the Human Development Report this year? And Michelle Lamont, let's start with you.
I think we have a lot of tools at our disposal to respond to this insecurity, in particular by sustaining hope. So as I read the report, I'm very struck by the role of institution, the role that is given to institution, and also the role that is given to culture. The stories we tell about what's in our future is crucial. So if we hear Mary Robinson say, we need to think about moonshot, it gives people really a notion that we don't have to fall behind. As the president of Tanzania said, it's also stumbling is about moving forward. So the message of hope is wonderful.
And it just reminds me of that brilliant reframe that Mary Robinson did at the beginning of the show when she said, you know, our best, think of it this way, our best future is ahead of us.
Exactly.
I love that. Ilona Sabo de Carvalho, let's go to you next and just get your responses. What's your key takeaway?
So thank you so much. So let me start by saying that it's a great honor to participate in this timely launch of the Human Development Report. So the report brings this fundamental message to the way forward. So many issues stood out for me, but I'd like to emphasize the issue of trust. The fact that globally, less than 30% of people think that most people can be trusted, which is the lowest recorded value. For me, this was really serious. It is a huge challenge that needs to be urgently addressed to allow for collective actions that we so badly need. So to work together to solve today's crisis, we need to rebuild trust.
Trust, that the report really highlights that. Victor Galaz, your key takeaway?
I mean, first of all, congratulations to the team putting together this wonderful, even though very worrying report with so many complex issues being connected. I think to me, one of the key messages is the fact that it puts the Anthropocene reality at the center of many of the things we're seeing. The fact that turbulence and uncertainty will be the new normal, and that we cannot afford, we don't have time to build back the same as we move into that turbulent phase. I think that's going to be one of the biggest scientific and political challenges, to find ways to use turbulence, to use uncertainty in ways that unlocks creativity and innovation, as is mentioned in the report. I think that's a really, really important message.
We're basically rebuilding the bus as we're driving it
Yes.
faster downhill
Exactly.
on a highway.
Yeah.
Michelle Lamont, there's a line in the report that really stood out to me. It says something like this. There is a nagging sense that whatever control we have over our lives is slipping away. You said that your main takeaway is hopeful, that there is hope. But how do you maintain that? How do you even start to make policy when people don't think they have control over their lives anymore? And other panelists, I want you to come in as well, but let's start with Michelle.
As we heard earlier, there's huge mobilization in youth for creating a different future. It's a moment where the labor movement has really been revived with during and after COVID. There's just an enormous mobilization happening at many, many levels. And I think a lot of this, the possibility for change hinges in amplifying the voices that are calling for people, taking our future in our hands and moving forward.
Where's this mobilization of change? Where's this mobilization? Who's mobilizing?
Well, you've seen it in Black Lives Matter in the United States and around the world. This is only one example. There's a huge push for inclusion that is manifested in the Me Too movement. It's my colleague
at the climate movement as well.
Yes, one of my colleagues at Harvard, Chenoweth, shows that the last 2-3 years have been the highest number of social movement mobilization since we have in recorded history. So there's a lot of collective awareness about the enormous challenges that are not behind us, that are still ahead of us, and a great sense of urgency. So, I think that this is the energy that we need to multiply and cultivate and give voice to. So a lot of the media are only covered polarization and, the rise of the far right in the US, but there's an equal amount of very positive development that are happening, not only here, but elsewhere as well.
And Victor, the climate movement or the climate issue is one where a lot of people speak loudest. This has really galvanized people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you see that clear. I think one of the effects that we're seeing because of the energy crisis that many countries are experiencing now is also the social dimension of the climate transition. So whether you want to call it a just transition or climate justice, that these things are inseparable. So, and I think that's the only way forward. If you want to keep hope and you want to have people feeling hope, you need to offer them a better life. So not just talk about the technology or ppms in the atmosphere, you need to talk, how do we create a prosperous life for you now? So integrate the social and climate dimension in a much clearer way now than we did just a couple of years ago.
Ilona?
I couldn't agree more. So I would just say that what really gives me hope is the young people. And when I hear what we're doing, when we just really engage them, when we put them at the table, I just believe that we cannot not act. So I would just also second what the youth envoy Jayatma was bringing, and just repeated here by Michelle and also by Victor.
Let me stay with you for a second, because you had mentioned the report and what it says about trust, a lack of trust amongst people, and then this line that had really stood out to me about a nagging sense that whatever control we have over our lives is slipping away. I just wonder how you reconcile both those stark details with the hopeful, what you just said that has a kind of air of hopefulness about it. I don't see how they reconcile. How do you reconcile those?
Well, I think to start, we need to realize that we have to build an information basis that is much more broader. So we still have a very unequal access, for example, to the internet, to the information that can be tracked. So we know that, for example, digital transformation is a fact. So right now we have 4.6 billion of people online, but in 2030 we're going to have 7.5 billion. So there's a lot of people left behind. So I do believe that if we really need to empower and include people, we need to connect those that are left behind, truly harness the potential of this digital transformation and to this amplification of voices that we want to see. Because only I think if we have that, we'll be shaping the right way forward. And to do so, just very briefly, I think we have to make the digital transformation human-centric by design, and of course, rights-abiding. And this has to be a starting point, not a side point. So empower citizens, get them involved in social change. So this will mean close digital divides, provide digital literacy, education to all, especially to women and girls, and pushing also regulation that protects citizens' data and privacy. So there are examples coming out of Europe, coming out of my country, Brazil, still early stages, but important examples.
One of the things that Igarape focuses on, I know, amongst other things, is technological innovation. So, it's great to hear you talk a little bit about that. But all of you, panel, we know that not only can it be an empowering force, but also a destabilizing force. And technology has been blamed for growing misinformation and polarization, how people use it. And this is a question that just came into us from our audience that I want to put to you. How can we combat misinformation to minimize polarization, build trust, and actually push forward on creating the kind of holistic policies that you're all describing? Because people may have access to the internet, they may have the tools, they may be 7.5 billion people online in a few years, but if they fundamentally disagree with each other, or they're believing things that are basically not true, that's not going to help us. So how can technology actually empower citizens? How can we combat misinformation to minimize or reduce polarization so that we can actually create the future we want? Who wants to start? I'm going to throw that open to anyone.
Small question.
Just a small one, yeah. Victor?
Maybe I can give it a try. I mean, just to have a little bit of a conversation on this. First of all, I think sometimes we're putting too much emphasis on digital platforms and blaming digital platforms. I don't think we would see the type of polarization we're seeing now if there wasn't any source in amongst the public for it to flourish. And I think one of the main drivers of polarization and lack of trust are social inequalities. I think that's quite clear. And there are ways that we can address social inequalities, and I think there are pathways presented in the report as well. Another point of conversation maybe is the fact how much of what we're seeing is polarization, meaning that you have two points diverging, and how much is actually radicalization. Parts of the political spectra moving very quickly. And I'm talking about the nationalist, populist movements all around the world.
That's a symptom of lack of trust, right?
Of course.
Lack of what they perceived opportunity.
Yeah, and social inequality.
I totally agree with you. And we know that one of the big problems in the US is the number of young people who are also parallel, the complement to what I said earlier, indifferent or very cynical toward politics. And this is highly correlated with social class and with level of education. So one of the things we very urgently need to do is figure out how to engage them in the political process so that they don't feel so alienated, and their current position leads them to be very easily, engaged by conspiracy theory. So we really need to rework on creating a democratic culture that is much more deliberative and where people understand better how the Pizzagate stories of the world are fabricated. We live in, the current moment is one where there's fewer gatekeepers when it comes to information than it was the case when the national newspapers were dictating what people could think. Whereas now we have a multiplication of sources, Substack, YouTube, Patreon, at all levels of creativity. It truly has been democratized. Now the question is really to bring the messages that are available to populations that are living at the margins, which I think can really make a difference in election and in other forum as well.
That is the question. And panel, you're here to give me the answer. What are the answers? Wow, silence.
So I would
go on, Ilona.
Just Rajesh, very briefly, I totally agree with issues of social inequality and also engaging young people and all people in politics. But I would just like to stress that for that, we need to go back to an era when consensus building was backed by facts, science, knowledge. So access to reliable information is really important. So we do need to get better dealing with disinformation and misinformation. So ramping up independent media, fact-checking content, improving moderation, and also regulation. So it's incredibly important that the information that is provided is at least verified, authenticated, validated. So we need to reestablish dialogue and create the basis that everyone is and strengthen the channels of communication and participation, which for me means to reopen civic space. Because when there's no dialogue, there's no civic space.
Have you seen any examples, Ilona, of how technology can do this successfully, or has done this successfully, and actually helped, empower citizens to be better equipped change agents?
Well, I think there's what we call investing in digital infrastructure. And I think there are countries that are understanding that need to get closer to be more efficient. So, for example, providing with the right privacy and rights, digital rights in mind, providing identity cards, the proposals that come with the cashless payments, the digital data exchanges for online public service provision to be much more efficient. So bringing people online, ensuring they have access to more targeted services. So including health, for example. So during COVID, we saw how important that was. So services that might not otherwise be available for them. So there is, I think, a game changing for governments to really get closer to citizens and much more effective. But also, not only in this way, I think that technology can also empower people politically, as we're talking here. So the idea that people can participate more actively in decision-making processes to help shape policies. So digital consultation, deliberative voting. What I know from that is still very local. So there are examples on participatory budgeting from Brazil. They're like global consultations, for example, to inform the UN Secretary General reform, our common agenda that we ran through our institute with the tracker with the people. So a lot of people participated and the proposals were included, were taken into account. So if done well, also I think that we can reshape governance and strengthen social contracts, increase the legitimacy and credibility that governments need so much, especially at this time of polarization and distrust.
Okay. Let's move a little bit. Let's move on a little bit, panel. We talked about polarization, misinformation, disinformation, but I also want to talk about this idea of paralysis. The report says that we know what to do in many instances, but we're just not doing it. Why are we not doing it? And Victor Galas, climate change is a classic example. We've known the facts of climate change and about planetary boundaries for decades, yet we are so far behind where we need to do. Why do you think if we know it, why aren't we doing it? And how do we stop not doing it and actually do it?
I think that's a good question. And I think that was discussed in the previous panel as well.
Yeah.
The key challenge here is to unpack the we. Like, who's the we? Who are the agents that are not acting? And I think if you look at it historically, the we are the people who have influence and resources to act. Some of them who have intentionally used uncertainty or spread doubt to block action. I'm talking about governments, I'm talking about financiers, I'm talking about some industries, and of course in the global north. So I think the we here, who has failed to act, needs to be specified. Adding to that is, of course, deep misunderstandings in general. One is climate change is something distant. It will not affect me, or it will not have an impact on the way we live. That's not true. We know it now. Another misconception: we can extract from ecosystems, we can modify landscapes, we can exploit the oceans without it having any impact at all on our economies or our lives. That's also incorrect. And on those incorrect assumptions about how the world works, we've built institutions, economic incentives, and economic models that are flawed. I mean, that to me are the three main obstacles to change. And I think we just need to recognize that we've been building the wrong structure on top on the wrong assumptions of how the world operates.
So it's this idea that we believe the wrong things, and therefore we act on the basis of the things that we believe, and that's taking us down the wrong path.
Again, unpacking the we. I think the we is very important here. I mean, not everyone has the same responsibility today and historically for putting us in the mess we're in today.
I'm very aware that the summer has been extremely difficult in a number of countries. The increase in temperature has created havoc in Europe, in the United States, elsewhere. One of the arguments in the report is that people have faced challenges when it comes to changing their mind because it's simply taxing to change your mind. Yet at the experiential level, we've just gone through a terrible summer. So I think that I'm very curious about how people in your field, in the field of resilience, are thinking about the role of experience in reorienting and leading people to become much more aware of the urgency. At the same time, there's very little agreement on what are the solutions at the level of everyday life. And people can use their bikes instead of their bicycle and, you know, get rid of their lawn and things like this. But you know, even recycling is highly debated. In the US, many supermarkets are not collecting the plastic bags anymore because we cannot ship them to China. So I think a lot of people feel very, you know, powerless when it comes to understanding what they can do in their everyday life that is actually doable. So what are the answers from people who are experts in the field, such as you?
I think, I mean, you would have to look at data. I think, again, we're scientists here. I think if you look at opinion polls, I think the IMF presented something a couple of months ago that people that were worried about the COVID pandemic became increasingly worried about climate change and not the opposite, right? Because sometimes you would expect that to cancel out, that you're so worried about the pandemic that you care less about climate change. That's not the case, actually. The problem that you also could see in that in those results is that people who were affected economically by the pandemic were less eager to act on climate. So I think that again points to one of the messages in that report, that you have increased economic insecurity makes it much more difficult to act on climate. But that's also part of the solution. The solution would that be that make sure that that climate transition is just, right? Make sure that people can afford it, and that will trigger action in different ways.
Why were they more likely to be worried about climate if they were worried about COVID?
I think there was a recognition that we're connected, right? When you see supply chains failing, suddenly, and there's also an understanding that actually climate change is likely to have similar impacts because of water or droughts or extreme weather events. That's going to have repercussions that are not local. Those would be global. So that was a little bit of a wake-up call for people, but also for businesses.
If I may add, I know in the American context, there's this very strong class dimension. The working class perceives, you know, riding to work on your bicycle as upper middle class behavior. And they also think it's the libs who are pushing the end to, you know, extraction of raw material, everything. It's all constructed in the context of a class struggle, if you will. And some politicians, such as Trump, have certainly exploited them this rhetorically in his presidential speeches and always. So that also feeds, I think, the resistance.
Michelle Lamont, let's Ilona,
sorry. No, I was just adding to what Michelle and Victor are saying. I think apart from linking issues, I think people are also bringing to present value the fears and possibilities. For example, the pandemic was something that was spoken about, but then people experienced that. So climate change is there. People are experiencing. So they're thinking, wow, is this real? This is happening. So I think we need really to harness the power of this, I would say, experimentation, unfortunately negative one, but to empower collective action. So I spent most of my life, my adult life, helping to build and support coalitions to drive this collective action and impact. So I'm a true believer in networks of people that just gather around shared priorities that are diverse, intergenerational, from all sectors of society. So defining this we that Victor says is very important. and also including people who may not always agree. So the only way we're going to get out of these problems is if we sit at the table together with all the stakeholders, the actors, the agents of change that are concerned about common problems.
Let's get a couple of questions that are coming to us from our audience, actually. There's quite a few coming in, and I want to give you the chance to respond to them. How can we deliver on the SDGs and Agenda 2030 in this uncertain world with many crises? This is something that Achim Steiner was saying a few moments ago, that actually the SDGs are the way forward and the way out of it, but actually, and Mary Robinson was saying, where are we now? Almost 2023. 7 years to go. We're kind of halfway through that timeline. So give us your thoughts, panel. How do we actually deliver on this extremely ambitious agenda, given the kind of overlapping crises that we have? Who'd like to start there? Victor, do you want to go?
Sure. I think one of the key, there are many obstacles, but I think one of the key obstacles is going to be investments that are mentioned in the report. There needs to be climate investments, and there needs to be investments that support vulnerable communities and vulnerable countries to adapt and mitigate climate change. I think countries need to deliver on the promises that they've made. Otherwise, the next COP27 negotiations will run into problems. I think there is a discussion to be had about loss and damage, meaning compensation for historic emissions for countries that are being affected and communities that are being affected in ways where they are just unable to adapt at the moment. So finance and financing things that build a positive climate and biosphere future, so meaning investing in nature. If we look into the sums of investments into restoration of ecosystems or agriculture or forestry, those are way, way lower than they should be. If you look at the IPCC, they should be 28 times higher for forestry and agriculture in the global south compared to today. So it's a massive, massive funding gap here.
But that's investments in tangible infrastructure.
Infrastructure and for people. I mean, it's also social capital, skill sets, education.
Okay, let's get some more thoughts. Ilona and then Michelle.
Jumping into Victor's conversation, I think one of the big issues is climate finance, because actually all finance for global public goods will have to have the climate lens, the youth lens, which is like that should be future-proof. We need to deliver to the future generations like a country that is hospitable. So, and beyond, I think to do that, to really put finance at the right place, we need to increase the science policy interface and the accountability that will come with more participation, more oversight on policy making by citizens. Because otherwise, policy making, like politicians, may divert from what we know has to be done. So finance, for sure, equitable finance, but in a way that we respect science and link it to policy like objectives, and of course monitor it for achieving the results. And this will only happen if we participate more.
Michelle.
It's a global problem that we're facing. It's a global challenge. We have global institutions who have mobilized, including mostly the UN, to address them. I think strengthening the support to the UN from a range of countries, including the US, is crucial. The solution, however, is not only economic. Among these goals, you have lots of them that touch on the questions of dignity. So I think developing a broader language about what development is about, putting questions of recognition and dignity equal level with questions of economics, I think will be crucial moving forward, because this is a way to also appeal to populations that are less well endowed than the advanced industrial country, and to really bolster this collective efficacy, this notion that we just need to, do the moonshot to pull ourselves together given the challenges ahead. Strengthening the collective identity as human beings living on this planet and emphasizing what we all have in common will be crucial, I think.
What are some examples of, like metrics that you could use to measure investment in, you said recognition and dignity?
Dignity. Well, it's mostly about diffusing messages about what we have in common. I know of economists, for instance, in Chile, Heuchmann, who has shown that the impact of dignity on well-being is equal to that of income. So from the economics profession, I think we've learned to think about well-being largely in economic terms, and this is very much in line with the human development tradition. And this is why I'm bringing it now. So I'm not an economist, I'm not an expert in measures, but there are researchers who are doing this now. And I think it's, I'm mentioning it because I think it's not always as salient as it should be.
And then you had talked about culture, the role of culture, right at the beginning of the conversation. I'd love to understand more about what you think the role of culture is in getting the world out of this mess, these overlapping crises, and developing policies that actually help people feel hopeful for the future and reduce insecurity.
Well, what characterizes uncertainty is our inability to project ourselves into the future because we don't know what's ahead. One of the ways of addressing this is to produce narratives or new scripts about where we're heading. The people who do that are people we may call agents of change. That includes people like us, experts, you know, but also journalists, comedians, entertainment people. And, you know, really think an enormous number of narratives are now created about inclusion. So, for instance, there are shows that are very popular now about trans population. This is just feeding a notion that we all owe each other mutual respect as human beings. So this is the kind of transformation that I have in mind to the extent that these changes are actually already happening. Data on diffusion of human rights, not only at the legal level, but also at the level of practices. The report concludes with tables on decline in gender bias and gender discrimination, how much populations across the world, men and women, are having a more equal understanding of what men and women can do in terms of leadership or economic leadership. So, you know, promoting the kind of narratives that transform views, I think, is something that is absolutely central to the challenges ahead.
Picking up on what you're saying, Michelle, panelists, let me just put this to all of you. And it's also this idea that, and I think Jayatha mentioned this in the first half of the program, that there is those who have held power, who have largely been white men from the global north, are feeling that the challenge to their authority and power is a zero-sum game, that if other people rise, we lose. And that seems to me to be what you're all saying we need to reframe.
I think that's collaboration, Rajesh. And I think the problems and the challenges are so huge, compounded, that there is a big job for everyone. So I think this mindset that needs to change from competition to like leaders that are like lonely ones. That doesn't exist, per se, because we know that behind leaders there are so many people working. So why not to bring them to the table as well? So I just believe that the leadership should be much more shared. Collaboration is, you know, in the order of the day. Diversity, because we have very weak problems to solve, and we need different worldviews. We need different generations to just be able to process what's going on. And I'll just get back to Michelle's point. We need opportunity narratives. We need to give back the chance for people to dream about a better future. And we are making decisions now in the next years that will shape possibly the next 1,000 years. So let's just bring people together so we make the right choices. Because if we fail everyone. It's for everybody. And if we succeed, which I really bet so, I'm as Christina Figueres says, a stubborn optimist. We can have the best years of our lives, the best centuries is still ahead of us. And I believe we have the knowledge, the tools, the capital. So narratives, but also collaboration.
Just as Mary Robinson said, you know, think about what if our best world was ahead of us? That's a great way of framing it. Here's a question from our audience, from Joni Carley, who wants to know, what can be done to shift norms and culture? You've sort of talked about the importance of it and that we need to. How do we do it? Michelle, maybe this is your area of expertise, I think. Let's start with you.
I've kind of addressed this question in the previous answer about narratives, and it's like 1,000 points of light in terms of reorienting a conversation. You just mentioned the question of older white male resistance. We know that cohort change matters a lot. Where are the allies going to be? We know in studies of discrimination that older men who have daughters are often more allies than those who don't. So we really need to think about the creation of networks of people who are pushing for change in the same direction. And often power has to be seized. It cannot be begged for. So we see, for instance, cohort replacement in a number of cultural industries following Black Lives Matter at the head of many foundations in the US, at the head of in the publishing industry, in the arts industry, even fashion. There's a diversification of leaders. And it also is, for instance, orienting where funding goes for scholarship, and our universities like mine, who are well endowed, getting more than their fair share of fellowships and such. So I think there's a lot of thinking now that is developing in a whole network of institutions about how to create a more equitable society, and the fact that so many corporations are adopting diversity, DEI policies, and are increasingly critical of the old approaches that are not working. Instead of simply promoting a few people, we need to develop systems of mentorships that will really systematically promote the talent. So I think there's a lot of very exciting thinking happening at many levels. It's happening already.
Do you want to come in, Victor?
Sure. I think, this is not my expertise, but I'm thinking that norm shift needs to translate into institutional enforcement somehow, right? And I think that's one of the biggest gaps at the moment. I think if you look into international environmental agreements or similar, the lack of a sanctioning mechanism has made them fragile, has made them not being able to deliver compared, for example, to trade agreements. Sorry, it gets a little bit technical here. But I think what the business community who is trying to tell a new narrative about this, for example, saying that we need to act on climate change and planetary change because this is where the future is for us as a business. There's no business on a dead planet. And they're asking for rules that apply to all businesses because they're playing in a very uneven field. There needs to be sanctioning of businesses who are not operating at the high sustainability and climate standards, for example. So I think, yes, norm shift, please, let's do it. And let's use the social tipping points that might be there. So we might see very quick norm shifts, but you need to follow up somehow with strong institutions and sanctioning for those who do not follow the rules.
Here's a loaded question for you all from Paula Miranda, who says, do you think that the SDGs are achievable by 2030, or will they be just a nice aspiration that we will not be able to reach? This is a question that we're going to start pulling our threads together and winding up with. So I will give you a chance to be more optimistic if you're going to answer pessimistically to this question, but that's the question. Are we going to achieve the end? We're sitting in the SDG studio in the middle of the UN headquarters. This is dangerous territory where whatever we say is on thin ice. But what are your thoughts on that? Ilona, would you like to start there?
So I would say we have to achieve them. And I think we spoke a little bit about how. And there has to be a redistribution of finance. So the international financial architecture has to really be refocused to deliver global public goods, and there will be discussions on the debt structure that we have today, on how we, for example, maybe just have to put incentives on carbon. How do we redistribute the value that we have in many countries, for example, with nature to be preserved, into the equation of how do we compensate for what we're doing unequally in the world. So the right to development is a right that everyone has to have, but we know that this development has to be sustainable. So just to say, if we refocus our finances and if we just really put the science and policy to work together, I believe we can leapfrog. And I just also think that the polarization is not allowing us to dialogue and to work together the way we need to for this leapfrog. But I'm trying and I'm an optimistic, and I think we should engage everyone in the same quest.
Okay, panelists in the studio, I'm going to use moderator's privilege here, and I'm going to slightly tweak this question to say, not are we, but what is your suggestion to policymakers? What is the first thing they need to focus on to ensure that we get on the right track to achieve the SDGs and the 2030 agenda on time? Victor, do you want to go?
Sure. I think one of the biggest risks we're facing now is the fact that things are connected. So you see a shock in the climate part of the system, and then you have a water shock, supply chain shock, etc. But I think this connectivity, the beauty of connectivity is that it also means co-benefits. So that means that if you intervene and you act on one of these systems, it will have multiple co-benefits. So if you act on climate, you will have likely biodiversity benefits, human health benefits, etc. And I think policy can do much more to act on those co-benefits, identify them and act on them and invest in them explicitly.
I would say that gaining traction in a much more intensified way is crucial, and that may mean deciding which one of the many priorities will be coming at the top. This is also aspirational. A lot is gained as we're aiming toward realizing these objectives. So I think that they should absolutely remain at the very top of priority, and a lot of resources should be directed toward them. I'm not enough of an expert to provide any very specific advice, but I would say that maybe deciding of all the objectives, which one will be most crucial, will be important, because there's too many of them, and 7 years is very short. So
I love that researcher's answer there, which is say, we absolutely have to solve it. Over to you, policymakers.
Exactly.
All right. Well, listen, panel, it's been fantastic to talk with you. Thank you so much for just giving us really new and interesting ways to think about things and questions that you've posed to us. Let me thank you, Michelle Lamont, Victor Galaz, Ilona Sabo de Carvalho, for your time and expertise today. Audience, thank you for watching. Thank you to all our speakers who are with us today and our global audience. Don't forget that the Human Development Report, as well as being here on my desk, is available at UNDP's website, the bespoke website, hdr.undp.org, and it will be linked to from all of UNDP's social channels. I think we've heard a lot, we've learned a lot. Please absorb the key messages of the report, this idea of this uncertainty complex facing the world, and also the way forward. We always have to have a way forward. The 3 I's: investment, innovation, insurance, all people focused. And then as Jayathma added to that, inclusivity as well. And I just want to leave us with this, let's take this frame with us, what Mary Robinson said, which is, let's imagine that our best world is ahead of us. That's a really powerful thought, and it's one that's certainly going to carry me through the rest of today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rajesh Merchandani. You can follow me on Twitter at Rajesh Merchant, or you can check out my podcast, Finding Our Flavor About Identity. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the UNDP Human Development Report team, and I wish you all, wherever you are, the best day. Bye-bye.